Any objection to being recorded? You should have. All right. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome back to our Environmental Humanities Lecture and Seminar Series of the Center for the Humanities and Social Change. We are happy as clams to be introducing Sasha Gora, who is a fellow of the Center for the Humanities and Social Change and has brought to the center a very important theme, namely food. I simply want to say that we are so happy with that we hope to develop that into a full-fledged research topic and concern for the future of our center. So without further ado, I'll let Sasha talk about Happy as a Clam, clichés, climate, and cuisine. And I certainly look forward to a very rich discussion after her presentation. Thank you, Sasha.
Okay, great. Thank you for the introduction, Shaul. My internet connection was just a bit unstable, so I hope that you'll be able to hear me throughout, but if not, just shout out. So to begin with, I'm just grateful for everyone being here on a Friday afternoon. I think most of you, but not everyone, is in Venice, which means a lot because it's very, very sunny. And as someone who grew up in Canada, it almost feels like a crime to be inside on a Friday afternoon like this. So I'm very grateful for everyone for being here and for those of you who are not in Venice for Zooming in. So as Shaul already mentioned, my talk today is called Happy as a Clam, Cliché, Climate, and Cuisine. So I just want to say a couple words about the title. So my doctoral supervisor, the environmental historian Christoph Mao, once told me that he is allergic to alliteration. These kinds of titles, he said. But now that I'm a postdoc, I figure that I can tell unruly, alliterated, even kitschy titles, which is to say, it's my seminar and I'll alliterate if I want to. And I want to because my research in Venice is starting to look at the connection between cuisine and climate change. I also want to say for the record that he's also allergic to question marks in titles. So please know that I did show some restraint. So I was thinking about putting a question mark in terms of Happy as a Clam, but he obviously has no allergies or sensitivities when it comes to metaphors. So a bit of a roadmap. My presentation today is going to be in 3 parts, and I should be talking for around 40 minutes, give or take, and then hopefully we have a big chunk of time for discussion. So the first part is titled Kiss the Cod, and it's going to be establishing the relationship between food and place. The second part, which is almost kind of an interlude, so it's shorter, is called A Ceremonial Hat for Eating Bouillabaisse. And in this part, I'm going to be talking about ritual and repetition, culture and clichés. And then the final part is called Clammed Up, so thinking about this connection between cuisine and climate. So I also want to give a bit of a sketch in terms of how this fits in with my past, present, and future work. So I'm a cultural historian. I largely focus on food, but not exclusively. I have a background in contemporary art, and I'm trained as an Americanist, so definitely a Russian doll in terms of these disciplinary layers. And if cultural history considers the domain of representation and the struggle over meanings as a fruitful area for the pursuit of historical understanding, food cultural history places edibles at the center of its pursuits. So here I'm thinking both about foods or things that are edible that people eat, but also things that are edible that people do not eat. So according to the Canadian author Noah Richler, nowhere becomes somewhere through art. And this is essential to the process of a place or a landscape coming into consciousness. So the sum of stories that are told about, or in particular landscape, he writes, quote, creates an impression of place that is imaginary but functions as any map would. So studying the history of food can reveal how everyday eating habits shape environments. So just an example of this is that according to the United Nations, food systems account for over 1/3 of global greenhouse gas emissions. And since people have been eating, which means since people have been people, foodways have shaped environments. However, studying the history of food, and this is what I'm trying to bridge in terms of my approach, is also to study how environments are produced and how environments produce and reproduce cultural imaginations. So at the core of my forthcoming book, which is titled Culinary Claims, A History of Indigenous Restaurants in Canada, is the belief that restaurants taxonomize animals and plants as edible. So the project that I propose to develop in Venice is called A Tale of Two Fish, Culinary Reactions to Climate Change. And with this research, I've been thinking about fish and shellfish, about seafood pluralities and shellfish multiples. So here I'm referencing Zoe Todd, Marianne Lind. I'm thinking about aquaculture and its byproducts, about water-based animals as commodities, about borders and spatialization, and about connections and disconnections in watery worlds. So I'm engaging with two interrelated questions, which are, how do human appetites change climate, and how does climate change influence human appetites? So my seminar today aims to exemplify the kind of stories that food can tell, and although my title features clams, I am going to start with cod. So I'm going to, Barbara, can you allow me to share my screen? Okay, perfect, thank you. Okay, so this is part one, titled Kiss the Cod. So this is an artwork by a Venice-based artist named Simona Carraro, and it's called Rural Gastronomy, First Fruits of the Season, so codfish. So starting with something that is very iconic and typical for Venice. So it's part of a larger series, and in the series there's different animals such as a young male chicken, there's also game, and so thinking about animal fruits. So Donna Haraway writes, follow the chicken and find the world. What do you find if you follow the cod? Well, obviously, if you follow the cod, you find Venice, but of course it is not called cod, but bacala. And bacala is not fresh cod, but dried. So the word probably derives from the Spanish word for cod, which may come from an Old Dutch word. And like any dish that is eaten with the same enthusiasm with which nations, regions, republics, cities hang flags, bacala comes with many a story on the side. So this is something that I focus a lot in my work. So really thinking about how stories season food and experiences of certain plants and animals. So follow bacala, you're going to find many, many recipes. So one of the projects that I'm working on right now is an analysis of English language cookbooks about Venice. So I'm really interested in kind of tourist and cultural imaginations, but also taking an environmental and geographical approach. So kind of questioning which animals and plants are allowed to participate in these recipes as storytelling devices, and how far out into the lagoon do they go. And at all the English language cookbooks I've looked at so far, so a good dozen, there's actually only one that doesn't include a recipe for bacala. As Rosa Maria Rosmando Lotorto writes, this dish has become an emblem of the city's cuisine, rich in distant echoes and exoticism. She explains that the history of this recipe has the vocation of a city that made the sea its land. Somewhat confusingly, however, bacala is salt cod rather than stockfish, which is called stoccofiso. But here in Venice, the terms are interchangeable, and as the names kind of illustrate, and I'm sure most of you are familiar with this, so my apologies for repeating it, but stockfish is essentially dried without salt, and as salt cod makes obvious, it's salted before drying. And bacala in Venice began with stockfish. So follow the cod and find your way. The story, and once again, this will be familiar to many of you, goes that the 15th century Venetian captain, Pietro Carini, introduced stockfish to the lagoon. So in 1432, he and his crew were shipwrecked off of Norway's northwest coast and were rescued by fishermen. So this was an area that had a lot of cod. And Carini described how the people there dried the cod in the sun and wind, it became hard, and they would beat it to soften it. So this was something that he had never seen before, and he likened it to minted coin in unlimited amounts, and he brought it back to Venice when he returned. Baklava, however, reached the height of its popularity in the second half of the 16th century, when the Catholic Church imposed on its followers days of fasting. So in this period, this was also the reigns of King Philip II of Spain, Elizabeth I of England, and the wars over the Atlantic. So wars waged between Catholics and Protestants, and this is kind of the origin of the saying that Baklava was born Protestant but died a Catholic. So follow the cod and find Newfoundland. Follow the cod and find Newfoundland in Venice. So this is on Via Garibaldi. I'm not sure if any of you have noticed this plaque before, the one that is here, but it begins in Italian, but is also in English and French. So it marks the house that was once Giovanni Cabotto's, but I didn't actually know this was his name until probably pretty recently, to be honest. I learned about him as John Cabot. So the plaque marks 1497, and it says that, quote, John Cabot, Venetian, and his son Sebastian discovered Newfoundland in the service of King Henry VII of England. Erected by the province of Newfoundland, Canada, to mark the celebration of the 500th anniversary of the expedition of John Cabot, the Canadian and British governments appointed Cape Bonavista, Newfoundland, as Cabotto's first landing site. So Cabot is celebrated as an explorer. He has a very intriguing, shady history. So he was born sometime before 1450. He acquired Venetian citizenship in 1476, and it's not known exactly when he died, where he died. He had to leave Venice. He was a trader here working in leather, but also property because of owing money to people. He ended up in Spain. He ended up later in England. And in 1496, King Henry VII granted him the right to sail in search of a westward route to Asia and, quote, lands unclaimed by Christian monarchs. So just as kind of an aside, in terms of the historical record, there's moments where he appears and disappears, but it is believed that he was potentially on one of Columbus's voyages, and that would kind of explain why the king would trust this foreigner who had kind of a dodgy employment record and didn't have a ton of experience with these kind of voyages. So on the second of three voyages in 1497, he coasted the shores of what is now Newfoundland and Labrador. However, there was a remarkable lack of documentation for a voyage that would be the foundation of England's claim to North America. So this history is commemorated across Canada, including with a 60-second video for Heritage Minutes. And I'm guessing, because this is real kind of Canadiana, this is not something that's familiar to people, but this is essentially a gift to cultural historians. They're very short clips, like I said, 60 seconds. They appear on Canadian public television in between popular TV shows, and it tells you a lot about Canada and its relationship to history, that it has to have these kind of cute, small vignettes explaining history. So this one for John Cabot is from one, and a man wakes in your Cabot, and he says, "You won't believe your eyes." They scurry together to the bow of the boat and witness a sea that has more fish than water. Codfish so thick they slowed the progress of our ship, he later explains to King Henry VII. So many that one could catch them by lowering a basket into the water. Quote, "Fish enough to feed this kingdom until the end of time." This is what Cabot boasts. So this marks the beginning of the so-called cod rush, and what later became what Mark Kurlansky calls the codfish aristocracy. So a great example of how fish claims land and how it creates wealth. Geographer Lenore Newman calls cod the fish that founded Canada, and historian Lizzie Collingham makes the case that Britain's quest for foodstuff gave rise to the British Empire. Her book, The Hungry Empire, even begins with Newfoundland codfish. So food is not an afterthought, but a driving force. And I think that's always something important to kind of explain when introducing food studies. Although the field has become a lot more popular, you know, it's still kind of a popular question to ask somebody how they can study food. So like with so many fish, so many species, cod is the name of a family of about 30 species of mostly bottom-living fishes in cool seas. In Canada, there's 9 in Atlantic waters, 3 in Pacific, and 5 in Arctic. But the most important is 1 Atlantic cod. So following Cabot's voyage, Europeans began exploiting these Northwest Atlantic cod stocks. And at first, this was migratory and seasonal extraction as opposed to settlement. Crews departed from France and Spain, Portugal and England, sailing in the spring and returning in the fall. By the mid-1500s, North Atlantic cod, salted and dried, accounted for more than half of all the fish eaten in Europe. Then in 1583, Britain claimed the territory. So Newfoundland is a really interesting place in the sense that it's one of the first parts of Turtle Islands, so a term used by the Anishinaabe to refer to what's now called North America, but one of the first parts that's seen by Europeans, and also thinking about kind of a short-lived Viking settlement that was about 500 years earlier, and hence the rather unimaginative name of Newfoundland. But it is also Canada's youngest province, having joined Confederation only in 1949. So the geography of the province and its cities reflects this. So settlers claimed shorelines and coves and bays based on their proximity to fishing grounds and didn't think much about soil or farming. The capital, St. John's, is located on the point of land furthest from Canada and closest to Europe. So its entire economy was based on Europeans arriving, catching fish, and taking their fish back to Europe. So this is not great image quality, but it's at the end of this Heritage Minute clip that I mentioned. And I just really like catching these words. So thinking about until the end of time. So fish enough to feed this kingdom until the end of time, Cabot had promised. But time ended on July 2nd, 1992. By then, the spawning biomass stock of breeding age cod had fallen to 1% of its peak. So this is what marine biologist Daniel Pauly calls an aquacalypse. The Fisheries and Oceans Ministry announced a 2-year moratorium after years of overfishing, and the government later extended the ban with no end date. So this moratorium was the largest layoff in Canadian history. Around 40,000 people lost their jobs, nearly 30,000 people in Newfoundland alone, and today the cod population remains too low to support a full-scale fishery, and the ban is still largely in place. So cod was eaten to scant stocks and is nearly a candidate for what Lenore Newman calls foods that we have loved to death. So thinking about foods that we have eaten to extinction or nearly to extinction or to endanger them. But according to Mark Kurlansky, cod should have lasted forever, and for a very long time, it was assumed that it would. So as late as 1885, the Canadian Ministry of Agriculture said, quote, "Unless the order of nature is overthrown, for centuries to come, our fisheries will continue to be fertile." And so as you see with the story that I'm telling here, the entanglement between human appetites, fish as commodities, and then technological developments overthrew that order in the Northwest Atlantic. So I'm just going to return to this plaque. So just around the corner from this plaque, and also on the walls of what was once Cabot's house, is a memorial to 7 martyrs. So this is dated August 3rd, 1944. And this recognizes 7 men who were shot and killed by the German command. The memorial ends with the lines, "The light of your martyrdom illuminates the path of the reborn people to freedom." So for me, it's really interesting to see this memorial and this plaque occupying the same building. And by mentioning the memorial in relation to the plaque, it is not my intention to compare one to the other. Instead, I'm very much interested in narratives. So thinking about how city walls celebrate discovery, how they mourn death, the death of whom or of what, and also thinking about how this changes over time. Or to borrow the words of Thomas King, a historian, writer, storyteller of Cherokee descent, he writes, quote, "Most of us think that history is the past. It's not. History is the stories we tell about the past." Before Newfoundland cod fed Europeans and then settlers, it fed the Beothuk, an Algonquin-speaking people. So the last known one, Shawana Danadit, died in 1829. And since 2015, when Canada concluded its Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the practice of land acknowledgements have become more common. And an example of one from Memorial University in Newfoundland, and I'm sure some of you have experienced or given land acknowledgements yourself, states, "We respectfully acknowledge the island of Newfoundland as the ancestral homelands of the Mi'kmaq and the Beothuk." So this shows that in Canada, the stories we tell about the past, what Thomas King calls history, are changing, slowly and too slowly, but they are changing. And discovery is a dirty word. It's also inaccurate. So it's kind of the question of when do these plaques catch up, or kind of thinking about the stories that they narrate, the histories they perform, and the people that they remember, and environments as well. So a cuisine tells stories on plates and at tables, in hands and aboard ships. A cuisine also remembers foods that have been lost, environments that have been transformed, plants and animals that we have nearly eaten to extinction, to come back to Lenore Newman. So cod no longer rules Newfoundland's economy, but it still dominates its culture, as exemplified by the screeching in ceremony. So I'm curious if anyone has any experience with this, so please tell me about this during the discussion. So after being imported from Jamaica, screech is a rum that is blended and bottled in Newfoundland. And so this ceremony is normally performed in a pub on what is called a mainlander, or a come from away, so someone not from Newfoundland. And one shoots the screech and kisses the cod after answering the question, "Is you a Newfoundlander?" with the long may your big jib draw. May your sails always catch wind, it means. So a jib being the sail in a schooner. So a cod, or a replacement, usually frozen but sometimes fresh, is held up to the lip level of each participant. I haven't had the chance to go to Newfoundland, but my poor sister lived there for a while, and you can imagine that I made her shoot the screech and kiss the cod and report back to me. So some see this as a cash grab that spreads an oversimplified caricature of the Newfie stereotype. And the ceremony in bars is really recent. So it's something that evolved in the 1970s as a form of tourist entertainment. And this is very common in tourism in general. And that's why with my research here, I'm drawing a lot more from critical tourist studies. But the folklorist Philip Hiscock argues that it goes further back to informal ceremonies in the 1940s and initiation rituals performed on sealing vessels and ships. But what I'm really interested in is the fact that although cod, the industry doesn't live on, the memory of it lives on in the culture, or kind of the performance of the culture on a tourist stage. Part 2, a ceremonial hat for eating bouillabaisse. So this is a 1936 artwork by Eileen Agar. And here, if we follow ceremony, we don't find someone shooting the screech and kissing the cod, but we find a hat. So Eileen Agar was a British painter and photographer associated with surrealism. So she lived from 1899 to 1991. And this 1936 photograph shows her modeling her artwork, one created for the biggest hit of the Cuisine from Provence. So this soup is particularly associated with Marseille, and it stars a crowd of Mediterranean fish. So from rakas, a bony rockfish and mullet, and perhaps crabs and lobsters too, and sometimes mussels, especially in terms of how Paris interprets the dish. So like bacala, bouillabaisse is equal seasoned with tradition and gastronomic polemics as it is with fish. Perhaps even more so is demonstrated by the legend that Venus, the Roman goddess of love, invented bouillabaisse to put her husband Vulcan to sleep so she could be with Mars. It developed over the centuries as a one-pot meal in which fishermen threw rockfish fresh off the docks into boiling stock. So by the late 18th century, a version was served in restaurants. Just as kind of a side note, this is something that food historians look at a lot in terms of kind of thinking about public and private lives of certain ingredients and thinking about what's home cooking, how gender factors into this, labor, restaurant food, etc. So we have this early picture, and then this is a picture of the artist in the 1980s wearing the hat again. And you can see also in the last picture that the hat kind of developed in different ways. And it's believed that there were about 3 versions. So the version that we see here that is now in the Victorian Albert Museum is constructed on a cork base that's painted blue and yellow. It has the likes of shellfish and coral, fish bone, tree bark, paper, and beads. So all of this is coming together to decorate this hat. So as I've been thinking with this artwork, I've been asking myself, what would a similar ceremonial hat look like in Venice? Venice is no stranger when it comes to hats. So if we think about the hats of the gondolieri, we think about the Doge's headdress, we think about the tricorn, which was popular in the 18th century, and it's revisited each carnival season, even during a pandemic. So I've been asking this question in terms of eating and ceremony. But also, what is the point of a ceremonial hat for eating seafood? What kind of ceremony does it perform? And what might a hat look like for eating bacala? For many tourists, Venice triggers seafood cravings. Seafood as ceremonial arrival. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen for the third and last part of my talk, which is called Clammed Up. And I think because a lot of you are in Venice, even if you're not in Venice, I think there's enough images. Venice lives on in visual culture so much. I think there's enough images in our heads to guide this last part. So eating is one of the most direct ways humans interact with environments by literally digesting them. As sociologist Krishnendu Ray writes in dialogue with the environmentalist Gary Snyder, and his work, quote, "Food is the field in which we daily explore our harming of the world at large, the animal world, and the plant world." So narrowing in on seafood, if eating, as Wendell Berry claims, is an agricultural act, then it has also become an aquacultural one. So in modern industrial diets, seafood is one of the few wild foods, meaning a food that has been hunted, harvested, or caught, as opposed to farmed or raised. I recognize that this is a very kind of simplistic distinction between kind of wild and domesticated, and it's a lot more gray, but I'll just go with it for this part. But it's one of the few wild foods that many people eat, or it has been until recently. So because of the Blue Revolution, more and more seafood is industrially farmed. So production of seafood from aquaculture now makes up around half of the total global capture, and this is including freshwater and oceans. So this has also produced new terms like wild salmon, which Marion Lynn and John Law talk about, traditional fishing, and artisanal fisheries. So I think this is actually a really interesting comparison to start to sketch out how we think about food differently on land as opposed to in water. So thinking about artisanal fisheries versus terms like family or small farms. So although farming fish is an ancient practice, contemporary aquaculture has transformed what this looks like and has disconnected it from the boundaries of seasons, biology, and geography. So fish stalls at markets and freezer aisles at grocery stores map the waters of the world. Even the Rialto Fish Market carries shrimp from Argentina, salmon from Norway raised on a diet of anchovies from Peru, spider crab from Spain, monkfish from Scotland, John Dory from England, calamari from South America, mullet from France, tuna from the Seychelles, and so on. The other day when I was at the market, actually one of the fishmonger was wearing an apron and it had the Norwegian flag on it. I tried to get a picture, it wasn't a great one. But I think that this is a really fascinating duality at play when it comes to fish that is dried versus fish that is fresh and kind of the narratives around them. So as the first part of my presentation established, one of Venice's culinary and really cultural staples is bacala, a dish that defines Venice, but it's not based on a fish from the lagoon, but on the Venetian Republic's history of trade. So according to literary scholar Shelley Boyd's reading of Roland Barthes' theorization of totem foods, meaning foods that are ubiquitous, nationalized, and capable of supporting a varied mythology which does not trouble about contradictions, she considers iconic foods to also be totem ones. So kind of thinking about bacala as iconic and also as a totem food. And this connects to what anthropologist Rachel Black writes in her 2012 book about Porto Palazzo in Turin. So she writes, quote, "Local food is produced at the market itself rather than just in the field on the farm." And I think this is a super interesting point, and it's one that I'm exploring in an article that I'm currently working on about Rialto Market. And, you know, I think that this is something that happens a lot. So I just listed where fish from the market comes from. Some comes from the lagoon, but a lot of it does not. But even if it comes from elsewhere, for people who shop there regularly or tourists who go to the market and maybe cook at a rented apartment, it creates this sense of a local connection to food. So I think this kind of performance or construction and the complexity of it is really important to think about. So not that something is inherently always local, but it's something that's constantly being constructed. So drawing from Rachel Black's work, I'm asking about what this looks like in Venice. So fishing has changed in the lagoon, but it has also changed the lagoon itself. So as anthropologist Rita Vianello, also here at Ca Foscari, has stated, while the fishers of the lagoon do not associate the rising sea and lagoon water temperatures with the increased intensity of aqua alta events, so something the literature shows, they do see warming as a primary cause of the changing habits of fish and their reproductive cycles, the presence of new species in the lagoon, and the disappearance or decrease of native ones. So like eel, once a popular catch, other fish have become less common, such as goby. Fish have become more common, like sea bream. Some are new, like the bluefish and the blue crab. So in addition to fish that have come and gone, tastes have also changed. Follow the ceremonial hat for eating bouillabaisse and find the mussel. Follow the mussel and find the farm. In Venice, as Vianello has shown, the popularity of mussels is quite recent. What was once considered unhealthy and undesirable has become popular. So it was a fisherman from Arce who set up the first mussel farm in the lagoon in 1939, and it was a practice that spread in the 1950s. So Vianello argues that traditional mussel farming is an invented tradition. Since its introduction, mussel farming has expanded only to then decline, and most recently has been increasingly replaced by offshore farms. Follow the farm and find the clam. So mussels already populated the lagoon before they became desirable, and there are plenty of clams as well. But in 1983, the Manila clam was introduced as an aquacultural experiment. An introduced species, sometimes called an invasive one, it became widespread in the 1990s as it was more profitable than traditional fishery catches. So it reached peak at the end of the decade and then also declined. So this period coincided with a reduction in the macroalgae areas due to both the availability of larger areas of the lagoon, but also having to do with nutrition and growth and degradation of plant matter. So clamming soon grew out of control and also expanded into prohibited and polluted areas. The dredging tools also have negative environmental impacts. So thinking about biodiversity, seagrass beds, and sediment loss. So this has all caused social, economic, and environmental tensions. To farm shellfish is different than to farm fish, but scale distinguishes early models from globalized and industrial practices. Industrial aquaculture often, for example, uses artificial lighting to control the seasonal growth cycles of fish, manipulating when a fish thinks it's day versus night. And similar to challenging and conquering seasonal boundaries, globalized seafood also collapses spatial ones. So thinking about historically, a fish was consumed immediately or preserved, aided by the likes of drying or smoking, pickling, salting, or canning. So going back to the example of bacala. And now the industry employs flash freezing, stretching the lifespan of a fish that is considered fresh. So I think this is also a really interesting framework in terms of a time-based interruption. But flash alone does not reveal much about geographical origins. And this is something that for anyone navigating Rialto, even if you've done it many times, or maybe it gets better after a while, it's always tricky to figure out where things are coming from. So shoppers must ask questions, they must rely on labels, and they must trust these labels. One study has shown, however, that 30% of labels misidentify fish, and these are examples of fish fraud and even fish laundering. So beyond misleading consumers, seafood fraud is of concern for matters like species conservation, environmental impacts, and the health of humans, sea creatures, and bodies of water. So labels reframe flesh, which means consumers need a great deal of what I call fish fluency to navigate grocery store aisles and market stalls. So one common recommendation to counter fish fraud is to buy whole fish as opposed to fillets, which are easier to identify. So these industrialized global practices have disconnected fillets from the rest of a fish's body, and now out of concern for consumer safety and environmental concerns, there is a renewed interest in a whole fish. Because of the local food movement, there's a growing interest in disconnecting from these systems and to sticking with local fish. But Elizabeth Probin, a cultural studies scholar, points out that fish as food requires us to go beyond a simplistic food politics. So she reflects on how food politics has been overwhelmingly focused on terrestrial animal protein, and she argues, quote, that seafood compels us to understand how entangled we are as consumers in the geopolitical, economic, cultural, and structural intricacies of the fishing industry. She also points out that we all eat fish, even if we don't eat fish, which is to say that 25% of global fish catch ends up in strange places. So as food for pigs and poultry, as oil supplements, as processed food for fish. Fish can also turn up in agricultural fertilizer and even in North American supermarket white bread. So this brings me to the conclusion, so I'm just going to wrap up now. So seafood also turns up in many English language idioms. The world is your oyster, they say. A fish out of water. To be a shrimp, fishing for compliments. There are plenty of other fish in the sea. Something's fishy. To drink like a fish. There are better or bigger fish to fry. A big fish in a small pond. To fish around. To clam up. And so on. Examples, perhaps, of what Steve Mentz calls saltwater terms. So I've named my seminar today after one such idiom, happy as a clam, which is much more known as the short version of the expression than the longer version, which isn't that much longer, but it's essentially happy as a clam at high tide. And the origins of this is at high tide, clams can't be dug up and are simply left alone and content and are not food. So it makes you question this expression a little bit. As Jess Battis, a literary scholar, asks in his essay, Breaking Bread, Queer Foodways and the Non-Human, does food have rights? Would that matter? He continues, thinking about the ways in which we coexist with food might galvanize us to treat non-human life in more ethical ways, respecting things that don't think, at least not in the way that we think, can only lead to a more expansive definition of the human. Eating shellfish is extremely messy, but eating in general is messy business. It's extractive, often exploitative, but it can also enact ethics, policies of conservation, and efforts to restore and eat with environments instead of just eating the environments themselves. Follow Venice and find the cod and the clam. Follow the cod and the clam and find stories about the environments we eat, harm, and attempt to heal. Follow the fish and consider the world. So that's the seminar, the presentation section. So thank you for paying attention, and I'm very much looking forward to your questions and comments and to a little bit of fishy talk.
Thank you, Sasha. This was brilliant and tasteful, and I don't know if you are aware of it. I haven't been to the Biennale yet, but I understand that there is a codfish sculpture at the Biennale that I don't know if Emiliano has already done his homework or if he can. But anyway, so I've only seen picture, you know, a picture from some dismissive spectator on Facebook, so I cannot offer you more information about that. But it's actually a sculpture made with real codfish. It's left, you know, hang out to dry, and so you can add it to your collection. Thank you so much. Maybe I'll just break the ice with a question. I'm so interested in the changing cultural and symbolic capital of food. How certain food is at some point characterized as very working class and very unrefined, and how in different ways it becomes something that is sought after and even classy and chic. And it seems that shellfish and seafood and mussels in particular belong to that category. So I was actually surprised to learn about how recent mussels culture is in Venice. But could you say something more in general about the mechanisms whereby at some point something that could be, so let's say, poor people's staples become something that is taken to a new level of prestige and price. And if you say something, because it seems that bacala in particular has been turned from something very popular to something very even chic. Whoops, I hope you're hearing me, or I'm
He's not saying anything. I'm back in.
She's coming back.
Sorry,
There she is.
My internet connection's sorry. Could you? I got bits of your questions, but could you sum that up again, because I missed it a little bit with the internet connection.
Can you hear me now?
Can you hear him? No. You want to switch computers? Maybe. Should I come to your computer? Or...
Is it my or your connection?
No, it's on our side. Sasha's going to use my computer.
Thank you, Heather. Okay, is the video on? Okay, yeah, sorry. You want to use, or should we share this? Okay, sorry, Cheryl, I only caught bits of the question in terms of changing cultural and symbolic capital and thinking about shellfish. Could you?
In short, you know, can you give us some more information about this specific case, or maybe some other example of how a certain type of food at some point is upgraded from, say, you know, a working class food to sort of middle class to even high end type of food, especially in relation to seafood, that in my experience and in my lifetime has really been sort of taken to a completely different level of as I say, you know, symbolic capital more than anything. And in particular, I was not aware of how recent the mussels culture was in Venice, and that was, you know, so eye-opening. And I don't know if you, both in terms of that and or cod, if you can say something of how and what cultural mechanisms and made that happen.
Okay, great. Thank you for that question. I mean, that's kind of what, you know, food cultural history is in a nutshell, right? Because this is constantly changing. This is a constant negotiation. And so there's so many examples of this. So you can think about kind of bread culture. You can think about it in a French context and thinking about white bread, and then during war periods, brown bread became more popular. But then after the war, people were concerned about, you know, sawdust or various things that were put in brown bread, and then it went back to white bread, and then kind of thinking about the low carbs movement, and then we're back to kind of these natural grains. And so these cycles are constantly changing. But I think what is really important to always kind of think about this, especially, you know, bread is kind of different than if we're talking about animals when it comes to kind of constructing food or food cultures. But one thing that I think is really important to always kind of factor in is kind of this connection between geography, supply, and culture, and how just because there's a food there doesn't mean that it's desirable. And this is exactly kind of what you're pointing at. And so there's a lot of things that come into play in terms of how that changes. So for example, from my own research in Canada, and this is part of the book project, I really kind of looked at the changing status of wild meats. So kind of thinking about how early settlers were totally dependent on indigenous foodways, or else they would have starved, they wouldn't have made it through the winter. And so learning traditional knowledge to hunt meats across Turtle Island. But then once they had strong enough numbers, it was a display of power to bring over animals from Europe, to bring over crops. So kind of thinking about the Columbian Exchange, thinking about cows, thinking about pigs, thinking about wheat, etc. And then to create their own foodways. But as then kind of a reaction to an industrialized food system that people are becoming more and more critical of, this has changed again. And so more often on menus, you see meats being advertised that are wild. In Canada, they're never actually wild. Newfoundland is a little bit different, but in pretty much every province, if you see something that is called wild boar on a menu, it was actually raised on a farm and slaughtered in a government licensed facility. But it's really just kind of thinking about, you know, this constant negotiation. So part of it just has to do with kind of thinking about power, about desire, about how sometimes it sounds kind of silly, but, you know, thinking about things in plentitude, or, you know, like it was a way to kind of assert power to eat foods from elsewhere. And a perfect example of this is, you know, at the beginning of canned foods history, canned food was totally cheap. It was totally expensive. It was rare. It was hard to get. It was associated with the military. And so it was people that had certain access to it. And so this has changed and will continue to change. So I think
Biba had her hand up, but there is also Iva.
Okay,
So.
yes, and in general, if you could please write your name on the chat so that we have a list. Bye, please.
Can you hear Heather, or do you want to?
Thanks, thank you very much, and it's nice to see also the colleagues from the fisheries science. So I hope they bring also some questions to Sasha. And Sasha, thank you for bringing or sharing, because for me, being in different sphere but talking about environment, and when you mentioned food, looking through food to environmental change, it's definitely a new story, but I see very much the connection. I just wanted to mention that also actually what Shaw was bringing in about the poor people's food, and it's definitely also something what's happening in Latvia, for example. We also have these fishes which are considered trophy fish, and then this, let's say, fish which you don't put a value on. So I just wanted to actually say thank you, Sasha, for bringing into this topic, because I think, as you mentioned when you were answering this, the question about that we have the food around, but we don't value it. So it's fantastic topic. So I hope to cooperate with you sooner or later again. Thank you, Sasha.
Thanks so much, Barbara. Thanks for being here.
Ivor.
I'll just talk slightly askance. I've got a bit of an infected eye, but my own doing after enjoying FC Venezia's promotion last night. But anyway, thank you so much, Sasha. What a, as always, well-crafted and elegant piece of writing in many ways, and delivery. I was really interested, first of all, I've been talking to Stefano Malvasia here, Malavasi, who is a fish scientist here. And there's some interesting work that he's been doing on the mussel farms, and actually thinking about the fish, fish that benefit from the kind of the conditions produced by the mussel farms. So it might be an interesting kind of way to look askance at this form of aquaculture within the lagoon. I'm thinking about this in relation to the work of Anna Singh and Elaine Gann, I think, and many others who are working on this broader project, Feral Atlas, to look at kind of environments that actually thrive on anthropogenic interventions. So that's the first kind of point, which is mainly a comment. And the second one was regarding truth and reconciliation. And I know you only addressed this very briefly, so you may, the question might not be so relevant for you, although I know it is in your broader work. But I'm interested to think about the kind of littoral space, but also the oceanic space as a site of truth and reconciliation, because this is kind of seems to be what the communities you're addressing, was it Algonquin speaking community peoples, and I was thinking about that in relation to how is the ocean addressed in truth and reconciliation. Seems to me, from my very maybe brief experience in the Colombian context, that the oceanic space is often kind of sidelined. So yeah, that was kind of my point, whether you'd come across anything around how Canadian truth and reconciliation had addressed the kind of oceanic,
Great, thank you for that comment, and as well for your question, Ivor. It's actually really, really important in terms of thinking about truth and reconciliation. And you mentioned kind of how the ocean is addressed, but obviously it is also connected to all watery worlds. So I'm from a part of Canada, which is the Great Lakes region, right? So kind of thinking about the traditional inhabitants in that region, and salmon is a really great example of that in this particular region around the Great Lakes, because now when we think about salmon, we really think about it on the coast, but there used to be salmon as well in Lake Ontario. And so that was something that, similar to wild rice in terms of development, settlement, that was kind of wiped out. There's recently been a salmon that's been reintroduced, but it doesn't have the same meaning, and Leanne Simpson writes about this. But Zoe Todd also writes about this too, in terms of thinking about reconciliation, taking a multi-species perspective, but it's more than human, because that's what's happened in terms of kind of I gave the example of cod, today. And I was joking with Heather the other day that because I write about salmon in my book, and I've been asked before why, you know, I don't look at cod, and obviously it's impossible to do everything, but today was a chance for me to get cod out of my system. I felt like I really needed to kind of address that. But, you know, thinking about cod, thinking about the beaver, thinking about commercialization and commodification of salmon today, and Canada being a country based on natural resources and extraction. So in terms of reconciliation, a huge part of that in thinking about how do people live together, how do people live on the land, is how do they live with the land and who is involved with that. And another thing that this is where it also becomes really interesting, and kind of this connects also with what Shal was saying, is things get very complicated in terms of thinking about treaties, but then thinking about kind of changing categories and then access to food. So for example, with a lot of First Nations, they're able to hunt on their reservations, but they can't hunt off of their reservations, and they require a license. And so all of this, then, you know, you can think about kind of restaurants are separate from this, but this has obviously been what my work has been about, kind of reflecting how restaurants are contact zones for all of these negotiations. So it really comes down to these questions of then which animals are allowed to be served, where are they coming from, what are the conditions, how are they treated, how do people live with them, etc. So thank you for that question, because I think that water is actually very, very foundational in terms of treaty rights, but also reconciliation.
Valentina.
Yeah, sorry, but I'm outside. I hope it's not too noisy. Thank you, Sasha. I really like how you wave together different stories, but also historical layers. And you built all these genealogies. I have two questions. One is, I was very surprised when I went to Lisbon to discover that bacalhau was also typical food from there. And that's also a port city. And I was wondering if there's a kind of a map of all the ports, if bacalhau is actually the typical food from all the cities that were important as ports in a certain historical period in Europe. I don't know, but it's something I've been wondering for a while. And the second thing is, I really like the way you brought clams into your narrative. And actually, I did a small research with a group of urban designers in the Po Delta, in the Delta del Po, where they farm the clams. And there was this it was a kind of a struggle between the local farmers who were considered doing traditional activities and working a lot and earning very little money. And the people working with clams who were considered modern people who were partying all night and were earning money very quickly. So it was really a clash between two worlds. So clams really like a symbol of modernity and prosperity somehow. So I wondered if you have encountered something like that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Valentina. I love that example with clams. So thinking about Lisbon, I think that's a great idea in terms of a project or a paper, because I was looking at a cookbook a while ago that was all based on the Venetian Republic. And so it was tracing what bacalhau means in different places. So kind of thinking about in Croatia versus Greece. And so where it's kind of similar to the Venetian version, but where elsewhere it has the same name, but it's a stew. And so I think that would actually be a really great mapping project. So something that I'll think about that. And then in terms of what you were talking about with the clams, and I think this is a great example in terms of kind of general like boom and bust with natural resource extraction, right? And that was something, as you said, happened with clam farming, that, you know, when there was this entire boom, and thinking about the value that was associated with it. But it also comes back to kind of monocultures or thinking about cash crops. So, you know, I think that a lot of scholars are more familiar, especially in kind of environmental history, about thinking about this on land in terms of kind of cash crops or this way of working. But I think that's a great example of it happening off land and in water. Did they publish anything about that based on that project, these urban designers? Okay, but I would love to learn more about it.
Sophia?
Yeah, hello. Hi, my name is Sasha Gora. I'm the fisheries friend of Viber, and she was so kind to forward this invitation to your talk today, which was really very enjoyable. Sasha, thank you so much. I work for the German government on fisheries and aquaculture and development cooperation. So also like very much how you differentiate between different places and how different people relate to this, because what we observe is very much a very colonial discourse lately, where people are like, oh, fish are friends, not food. But mainly, thinking about the global north and not thinking about different parts of the world. So it's really brilliant to see like just these deep connections. I have 3 questions, which I don't know if are too much. So I will start with number 1 and then maybe you just cut me off. So my question was about, you talked about the natural and wild aspect, also relating it to your work about wars in Canada. And I was wondering if now coming from Canada to Europe, how you see here the natural wild aspect, because our environment is very much naturally overformed, especially when we look at freshwater or coastal environments. There are very little which are really pristine or natural, and what is then really natural or wild. And this is particularly true for salmon or beaver, so populations which were really small at some point and then had to be expanded again. So is it then really, so do we then need a different idea of what is wild and natural? And I would be interested if your perspective has changed there, or how you see this in comparison to North America. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. And thank you for coming, and thank you, Baiba, for sharing the invitation. So actually what you were saying about fish as friends and not as food, this is something that I find super, super fascinating. And I have a chapter in my book that looks at a restaurant in Toronto that serves seal tartare and got into a lot of trouble for doing so. And there's a great passage from a memoir that Sheila Watt-Cloutier wrote, and she's an Inuk activist and environmentalist, and her book is called The Right to be Cold. And in it, she talks about how a filmmaker from California, he came up to the Arctic, he was making a documentary, and I don't think it was, I think it might have actually been whale, but not, we'll say seal for now. I don't think it was seal. I don't remember exactly which animal it was. But she asked him, you know, somebody brought some back to the village and they were about to eat it, and they asked him, do you want some? And then he was like, no, like I respect seals too much to eat them. And she said, well, I respect seals so much that I do eat them. So I think that, you know, this is always kind of an interesting dynamic, and there's something that, you know, this relates also to Kelly Donaty's work around multi-species gastronomy, which I didn't have the chance to get into today. But kind of this idea of, you know, eating and being eaten, and kind of the discomfort it gets into it, or different forms of kin, or this idea of, do you not eat friends? Do you eat friends? How does that work? But in terms of the question that you ask, this is something I think is super, super fascinating. So I've actually been living in Europe for, I guess, about 10 years now. I lived in Copenhagen for a year, and I lived in Gothenburg in Sweden for a year, and I was in Berlin for a bit, and then I've been based in Munich for almost, I guess, about 8 years. And when in Munich, one goes to the Alps, one spends a lot of time going hiking, going to the Isar. And one of the things that I really started to think about, so kind of thinking about this question, comparing Europe to North America, or ideas of constructions around what is natural, one of the things that I realized from spending so much time in Bavaria was a lot of the quote unquote nature that I experienced in Canada, or at least in Ontario, was pay to use nature. So I think this is also very different. Like, I'm sure Baiba has good examples from thinking about Latvia, also in Nordic countries. I think, you know, in Finland, there's kind of like the right to forest, the idea that any person can pick berries or go mushrooming and, you know, kind of cross property. In Canada, if you're ever driving through kind of the heat of Ontario, and sometimes around Toronto, it gets very, very hot, like sometimes like up to 40 degrees, and you're driving around Lake Ontario and you're looking for a place to swim, to just jump into the water and cool off, you'll just see sign after sign telling you not to trespass, telling you there's an angry dog, telling you there might be a fine, and then maybe you'll find a provincial park, maybe you'll find a national park, and then you'll have to pay like $20 to go in for maybe an hour to jump into the lake. So I think that this is actually a really interesting an interesting point in terms of maybe it's a little bit different than what you were thinking about with your question about, you know, do we need a different idea of nature or environment, or what is natural and how does this change based on geographic and cultural lenses? But I think this point of access is really, really important and is maybe overlooked. So, you know, Canada, Glenys Hood, she wrote a great book about the history of beaver. But she also has this line about, you know, how Canada is defined by the nature that it nearly destroyed. And that is really kind of related to kind of thinking about the history of the beaver trade, but a lot of extraction. And I mean, this is a really, really severe example if we look at the Alberta tar sands. And so thinking about, you know, what that means into kind of day-to-day experiences, like the vast majority of Canadians live pretty close to the American border. They're in urban and suburban neighborhoods. They're all kind of huddled up close to the US trying to keep warm. And so I think that actually in terms of day-to-day experiences and constructions of the environment in Canada, it is very different there than it's imagined to be from elsewhere, sorry.
I don't know if you can.
Oh, great.
This is the Bacala installation that apparently is on display at the Biennale. That's everything I can offer you for now. But if I can ask another question, I'll actually start from a little piece of gossip that I'd like to share with you. Please, all participants, keep it confidential. I was recently in a meeting where our university, Ca Foscari, was debating whether to join a network of cities applying to become one of the lighthouses of this brand new European program called the New European Bauhaus. And the debate was whether to go alone as Venice, as a single city, individual city, or whether to join Lisbon and other northern cities. And for a Bauhaus of the seas, which was in fact the final decision. So we're now officially, this is why this is sort of innocuous gossip, but you know, we decided that we will go with Lisbon and the others as one of the lighthouses of the Bauhaus of the sea. And what makes this proposal very compelling is precisely that it tries to, let's say, move away from the narrative of Venice as the unique, exceptional, singular city, and thinks of Venice as a city that, with its own peculiarity, shares the challenges and predicament and opportunities of other coastal cities. The reason why I'm saying that is because one of the most vocal advocates of the opposite point of view dismissed that network, call it the Bacala network. You know, says, oh, are we doing the Bacala network? And I was struck by, and the reason why I also want you to comment on this is because, of course, this person was really trying to, be dismissive in a way that not only missed the importance of the network, but also the fact that, as a matter of fact, Bacala network would be a fantastic topic for this idea, you know, because Bacala, as you pointed out, brings together environmental issues, historic issues, cultural issues, and so on and so forth. And having made this comment, and since this Bauhaus is going to be a series of actions and projects, if you were to imagine one specific action or practice that we could enter into this competition, what could we do to make a bacala-related project that would become a strategic part of, or at least a component of this new Bauhaus of the sea, whose idea is to imagine the city of the future in terms of beauty, sustainability, and inclusiveness. So any idea of what we could do to show to this person that he was wrong?
I don't know. I feel like maybe you could give him some dried stockfish and a bat and let him go at it for a while. No, but I think that's interesting. Why do you think that he, like, in terms of kind of using the Bacala network, do you think he was, was it about the project as a whole in terms of connecting these cities, or was it kind of a derogatory thing to reduce it to food?
Well, I think that, first of all, he wanted to let's say, play down the prestige of other cities. But what struck me, especially after your talk, how he used food as a way to, again, belittle the importance of that connection. In fact, I could qualify my comment in question, say that as a cultural historian of food, you, of course, are aware how food is also a very, at least for sure in Italy, on the one hand, food is perhaps the most important part of our identity. On the other hand, it's so difficult to present it as, let's say, an academic discipline. And so how to pitch food as a subject worth exploring in its historic and cultural and identity terms, I think it's an important issue to discuss, because they're, yeah. Okay, thank you. I see Bye is making a very interesting comment, and yep, Tamar has a question.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk, Sasha. This is not necessarily a question, it's more of a musing, but just to piggyback on this, these other comments about bacalao. When Valentina made her comment, I was really struck how my experience of realizing that bacalao wasn't just one nation's cuisine was completely different. I have a good friend, an Angolan friend in New York, who made a big birthday party one day and cooked his favorite Angolan dish, which was a bacalao stew. And I thought of bacalao as Angolan. And I knew that there was some kind of, Portuguese history behind it. And he had told me that, in Brazil, people might eat it too. But my first encounter with this was as an African dish. And now I just sort of out of curiosity looked it up. And apparently today, Angola is like the #1 place in Africa that imports cod from Norway because people love this dish so much. And you can imagine that the price differential is pretty big, but it's such a prized, the dish that they make, which I don't remember what it's called, is so valued that that it's worth it, And so this makes me wonder, going back to Venice, whether it would be possible, locally in Venice to look at bacalao as, through this prism of the different cross-sectional colonial histories that bacalao has carried. Because it's interesting because you're as a food historian, you're also a historian of colonialism. But the examples that we've focused on so far have been of settler colonialism, right? So I guess there are just, so many different questions that come up for me around that, how different kinds of colonialism are so distinct. I wonder if fish cultures kind of reflect those distinct colonial practices, you know, between, let's say, imperial colonial practices that that might have been borne by the sea versus settler colonial ones in Canada. But also, I mean, it was just then, you know, from getting back to the personal musing, it was interesting to me how when I first heard about bacalhau, here in Venice, I thought back to my friend Tomáš's dish, and when I asked people about it, they're like, no, that's a completely different thing. That is, it's culinarily different, it's historically different, completely different. And now I wonder, you know, well, yes, of course, it's very different and that's important, but I wonder if there's some interesting corridors that bacalhau could take us on to sort of open up the cross sections a bit more and learn something about colonial history through like a very local Venetian dish.
I obviously
your question, sorry, but
no. I obviously love that, Tamara, and I actually I'm going to bother you for more details later. So I want to know more about the soup and the ingredients. But I think that what you mentioned is super, super interesting because, you know, like I said, bacalhau, it just means like salt cod, right? And so the fact that then people imagine kind of an ingredient or different dishes, so kind of thinking about how food performs almost different grammars in terms of, or almost like dialects or accents about where it's spoken is really interesting, because when I also mentioned, you know, so definitely kind of thinking about northern context or more kind of Turtle Island, but expanding from that, like the Caribbean is super, super interesting with that too, in addition to stockfish or kind of like Jamaican food and thinking about ackee or what it's called there, and how some of these things are similar, how they're distinct. And one of the things that is quite interesting too is I mentioned kind of the cod aristocracy, which is a term that Kurlansky uses, and he also talks about how the New England merchants of the cod trade were deeply involved in slavery. So this is something that then is all kind of connected through this. And so not only because they were supplying the plantation system, but because they facilitated the trade in Africans. So in West Africa, slaves could actually be purchased with cured cod. So there's this whole other aspect to this that you bring up with this dish that, you know, I didn't get into it, but what I think is also a little kind of funky is just kind of thinking about, especially kind of in a Caribbean context, that even though cod was then seen as good food for Catholics, the words for salt cod also has like sexual connotations. So that's a whole other layer to this. But I'm kind of thinking that I'm going to have to write about cod now. Okay, should I try to go back to see if mine works? I'll try to
Barbara and, Barbara and then Emiliano.
Okay, thanks.
My question, Sasha, was about trust, because I have the impression that city dwellers especially, and I don't know about anyone else, know less and less about how to decipher the quality of food, especially fish. And in the case of fish, there is also the issue of danger, because there is so much associated to dangers of eating fish which is not fresh. I'm thinking of mussels and cholera, but also of the fact that fish can give you particular poisoning and other things like this. So as we know, we are less and less capable of recognizing, for example, fresh fish from less fresh. We have to trust the people who are selling it to us, either on a personal, because of a personal bond with, you know, your pescivendolo di fiducia, you know, the one that you always go to and who will, you know, will give you the right thing, which also adds other layers of the pleasure of being in the market, you know, knowing that you've acquired a certain status with a certain seller. But also the trust you need to develop towards labels, not only the labels in the market, but the labels in a supermarket too, when you buy frozen food or stuff like that. You know, do we trust more what is written behind the frozen fish box, or do we trust more what fish seller in a unknown city that we cannot have a personal relationship with will tell us. I was wondering whether you've ever come across the issue of trust in buying fish.
Yeah, thank you so much for that point, Barbara, because that's actually, I had a piece that was just published in this newspaper that I distributed to everyone here called Arts of the Working Class. Thank you, Emiliano. And it's about food knowledge and migration. And in that, I kind of, it was based on a piece that I presented at Berkeley in the fall, and I talk about culinary knowledge and different terms for it. So kind of culinary knowledge, food literacy, food knowledge, etc. Kind of traditional food knowledge, kind of doing a survey of how we think about that and how we think about knowledge based on food. And what's really interesting is that in terms of how the terms mediate kind of these histories, is a lot of it now has to do with the knowledge behind buying food, as opposed to kind of producing food. So kind of thinking, and this is something that the ethnobotany group works on so much in terms of plant identification and the relationship to plants. But yeah, exactly that point. So kind of thinking about the difference between being able to read a landscape and see what you can eat safely versus, like, I mean, I still, when I go to Rialto and I'm trying to figure out like what to get or what it is or where it's come from, I spend a lot of time trying to figure that out. But trust is a huge part of that. And so it really kind of thinks about how does that also reflect intimacy or distance in terms of different levels of food production. But there's also extreme eating. So I'm sure that, you know, then that's the example of kind of those who go against trust.
Sorry, oh, Emiliano.
Yeah. Sorry, I don't want to add more fish to your fry, but something that was in my mind listening to your wonderful presentation is how you feel about anchovies. I feel also they play a big role in the European economic history in a way, and also because this may be more personal, but I come from Piemonte, and for some reason that I never fully understood, anchovy is a traditional dish of Piemonte. It's present in several dishes, like Magna and Bagneto Verde and this sort of stuff. And through migration, of course, it made its way to also to Argentina, Brazil, where Piedmontese migrants traveled. Yeah, so when you were talking about bacalao cod, not even from the lagoon, I immediately thought about my own connection to anchovy that feels like a homey food. When I was living in America, and I would want to make like a food that tasted like home, you know, use anchovies, and every time I thought like, this is so fucking weird. Why is this from Piemonte? It is a region of mountains and plains and rivers, and so yeah, definitely. I'm curious if you ever thought of anchovies in any way in your research. Thank you.
Thank you, Emiliano. I'm actually putting together a book proposal about the global history of the anchovy for Reaction Books Edible series. So I'm starting to think a lot about the anchovies. And so I think, yeah, that's a great example too, in terms of kind of, in some ways, that deep connection to place, but also a bit of a spatial disconnect in some ways. But one of the things that I think is just really interesting about anchovy in general, and this kind of goes back to the point about that Elizabeth Probin makes, and also the work of Hannah Landecker, in terms of kind of the feed that feeds food. So the prevalence of anchovies as feed for other fish. I mentioned that also in terms of thinking about salmon. But I think that anchovies are a really funky thing because they're very polarizing as an ingredient. Just kind of thinking about, I'm sure you experienced Americans who are like, ew, anchovies, or that was kind of my childhood. association, but they're prevalent in so many sauces and so many seasoning. And so really thinking about kind of when are they present or when are they quote unquote hidden. So I'll talk to you more about that because I'm working on the anchovy project. Thank you. I think Heather is also trying to ask a question. And thank you, Heather, for letting me use your laptop as mine occupies itself.
So as I wrote down in my notes, you mentioned that you look at things that are considered edible at the beginning. Yeah. Which of course got me thinking about Heather Davis's work around plastics and eating plastics. And also Lindsay Kelly also talks about eating plastics like as a rice filler and stuff. And yeah, so at one point during your talk, you said something was seasoned with tradition. So how extendable is your definition of edible?
Thank you for that question, Heather. Yeah, plastic. I've definitely focused more on plants and animals than plastic, but I think I'm going to look more into that. So thank you for suggesting that.
Sophia has another question. While Dark
Yes.
is over.
Yes. I was wondering, now we were discussing coming from salmon to cod to anchovy, and really there are so many species known in different places which have this important role in people's life. And we're a bit fighting the fight to come from that fish is not only like a dollar sign, and it's also not only an amount of protein, but like including these, yeah, in my language I call it like these cultural values. No, we use it in fisheries, the ecosystem services approach, to say, oh, there are these cultural values. And so this fish is also important for this and this reason, because people use it for recreation, or it has this cultural or this food history. So Sasha, I would be interested in if you thought about like how to put these complex narratives and histories into indicators which could be used to present to policymakers and to be like, okay, well, this fish, it's not only valuable to preserve it or to maybe not overfish and extinct it, because it has this important history. And yeah, so I was wondering how your feeling is about indicators and simplifying these complex stories and relationships.
I mean, it's an excellent question, and it's really the challenge, right? Because in many ways, I feel like the cultural part is what is often missing in a lot of studies or a lot of policy recommendations, you know, where it's very kind of easy to say that we should eat this or we should not eat that, or this should be taken into consideration. But it's kind of based on not thinking about, yeah, like Emiliano's story about eating anchovies and feeling at home, or, you know, kind of thinking about the materiality or the physicality of it. And that's, yeah, I think you're right in terms of, you know, thinking about these are complex narratives and with indicators. So I don't really have kind of a quick answer to that, but I do appreciate that question. And I think that, you know, this is the big question about, you know, where is culture in these recommendations, or how is it considered, or why is it not?
Emiliano?
Just a quick follow-up on that, which I also thought it was very weird. This report that came out a couple of days ago by the Lancet, Food in the Anthropocene, which marked kind of like the moment in which the term Anthropocene made its way to food policy making, and again, it was the same stuff, like absolutely culturally very daft, without considering, you know, the histories, gastronomic histories of the world. Just this very prescriptive way of how a diet should look like and why it should look like that, right? And it was absolutely enraging, but definitely it can be a point of departure to develop like a critique, a gastronomic critique, or a critique that comes from a position of gastronomic diversity.
Sasha, you have a comment on that, or there's Katinka who wants to ask a question?
Yeah, no, I think that, I mean, that's a great point, and that in many ways is kind of at the core of my work about thinking about Canadian food colonial history, right? Because it's kind of thinking about, you need to eat so much milk a day, so many grains a day, and thinking about how nutrition always reflects specific ideologies. And so that's what it comes down to. But yeah, no, I think it's a big topic, and I like the idea of kind of a gastronomic critique and thinking about, you know, how to create more room for complexity and for culture in these prescriptions.
My question was not as much as a question as a comment, kind of hatching on to that. If we look at, for example, invasive species, in particular in the Venice Lagoon, we have a lot of invasive species from Asia. For example, a type of jellyfish that is known to be eaten in Asia, but is not classified as food here. And its main concern appears to be the pollution. Is it safe to eat the jellyfish? Not because jellyfish might be unsafe to eat, because they are eaten on the other end of the world. Yet the worry here would be the environmental changes and the environmental pollution going on. So if we look at kind of like the standardized idea of diet worldwide, at this point, regulations start preventing us from that, being it good or bad, not saying anything on that, but because of environmental differences over differences in species. That was it. I wanted to put that
Yeah, no, thank you for that. You know, it's a great point, because that also like adds another layer of complexity, right? So it's like certain species, or Elizabeth Hooper has written a great book about this, about a Mohawk nation, the river is in us, in terms of, you know, fish that are contaminated with PCBs, right? So a lot of the fish that are caught locally, that's exactly an example of a local fish, or something that you would be wanting to eat, but you can't because of contamination. And so that's a whole other layer, and is also why the reason, you know, like it is complex. I really think that prescriptions don't work for that complexity, but what I think does work, and that's why I am thinking a lot about kind of multi-species gastronomy, is thinking about diversity in this narrative and these connections, and thinking about, you know, how food connects all these different places and all these different issues together.
Any other question, comment?
I would like to tell Sasha that when I was researching Neapolitan journals who were talking about North America in the late 18th century, I remember there was an article speaking about the beaver, this mysterious animal that they had in Canada. And they said that the unique feature of the beaver was that it had the body of meat and the tail was made of fish, was fish meat. And so this animal contained all the elements, you know, the nutritious element that a human being needed. I would be really, really happy to find that. It must be still in some box of my old photocopies. I thought it was it always stuck with me for many years.
Yeah, this is something that Baiba and I have talked about a lot, and I'm going to join her in Latvia to go beaver hunting, because I've published 2 pieces about beaver and the fact that it was classified as fish. So it was something that people could eat during Lent and on Fridays, and that beaver was actually like a super common food in parts of Europe, and the numbers were reduced because of that, and that was before kind of the fur trade. So that's, to me, a great example of kind of you know, thinking about conflicting imaginations of the edible.
This would have been in the 1780s, more or less.
1780s, okay, yeah. Yeah, and the funny thing is, so I haven't had the chance to try beaver yet, hence going to Latvia with Viva. But I have heard from someone who is working at the Noma Food Lab that Josh Evans, that beaver actually, because there's the Euro-American beaver, or the Euro-Asian beaver, and then there's the North American beaver. And there are separate species, but this wasn't identified until the 1970s. Because they look pretty much the same, and apparently they taste a little bit different. But I've looked at some historical descriptions and contemporary descriptions of how beaver does taste. Viva, you can tell us more about this, but there's some funky ones in terms of what you were describing with kind of fish or duck, or, you know, I've been told like muddy duck, or kind of like clam or chicken, or like also like pretty much any type of animal you can imagine. People have described beaver as tasting like that.
Thank you also to Marta for her remarks.
Yes, thank you, Marta.
Okay, so I think we've had a very rich, informative, and original presentation, a very nice debate. Thank you very much, Sasha. I look forward to meeting with you, Emiliano and Katinka, to talk about mid-June. I think we have a lot to discuss in terms of the event you're preparing. So thank you everybody for joining us. And we have a number of other seminars awaiting us to end this series until I think mid-June. And so I'll ask Barbara to help me remember that our next event is next week.
Exactly, we have two events next week, one on Thursday and one on Friday. I think on Thursday, I'm going at memory, as you know, it's
okay,
not always reliable, but I think on Thursday we have the meeting with the Acqua Grande project, and on Friday the ECFT HSC seminar with Ivor Duncan.
Wonderful. So we'll continue to be on the blue side of things. Thank you very much, Sasha. Thank you very much. Please be aware that you need to register for future events, so you can write to our main email account. I wish everybody a great weekend.